As World War II progressed into its fifth year, the German war machine, which for Adolf Hitler had once seemed so assured of military supremacy, was well and truly faltering. Defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943 had cost the Nazis dear, and the Allies were well placed to capitalise on their advantage. However, the Allied leaders were all too aware of the dangers still to be overcome, and they proceeded with the utmost caution, beginning to take tentative but very positive steps towards victory. By July 1943, progress was very definitely evident. At sea, the Allies were winning the Battle of the Atlantic. Measures agreed by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and US President Franklin D. Roosevelt at the Casablanca Conference 7 months previously to beat the U-boat menace were now yielding results. For the Germans, with morale plummeting among the U-boat crews, their commander, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, had no choice but to order them to withdraw from the main convoy routes in the North Atlantic. But for the Allies, it was just the boost that they needed. Success against the U-boats meant that the British and the Americans could proceed to build up forces for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Western Europe. In the skies over Europe, Operation Point Blank, the code name given at the Casablanca Conference for a round-the-clock bombing campaign against Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, was underway. The American Army Air Force pounded targets all over Western Europe by day, while the Royal Air Force continued by night. In the meantime, the campaign in North Africa had ended in a total Allied victory. By mid-May 1943, nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers in Tunisia had passed into Allied captivity. For Nazi Germany, it was a bigger military disaster than Stalingrad had been. British and American military planners were now busy preparing for the next stage in the war, agreeing on a Hitler-first policy. In May 43, Churchill, Roosevelt and their military staff met in Washington, D.C. in a conference codenamed Trident. With the whole of North Africa about to fall into their hands, the Allies agreed an invasion of Sicily, codenamed Operation Husky, was the next logical step. But over where to go after that, there was no consensus. The Americans wanted to invade northern France in order to secure a rapid end to the war. The British too wanted a cross-channel invasion, but only after Nazi Germany's powerful forces had been worn down elsewhere. They feared a bloodbath similar to the slaughter in the trenches of the First World War. The British argued that toppling Benito Mussolini's fascist regime, knocking Italy out of the war, and making the enemy fight for southern France, the Balkans or Greece would be the best way to guarantee success for Overlord. The Americans strongly disagreed, arguing that such a strategy would be a diversion of resources and effort. They were pushing for an early cross-channel invasion, as it would take the pressure off the Red Army on the Eastern Front. Because all the while, lurking at the back of their minds, was the fear that if they didn't, the Russians might do a deal with Adolf Hitler, as had been the case in August of 1939. Nazi Germany still possessed huge swathes of Soviet territory, and as the snow melted with the return of spring, Hitler's generals looked forward to avenging the disaster at Stalingrad. So, as preparations for Operation Husky fell into place, with Hitler convinced that his enemies were targeting an attack on Sardinia, thanks to the efforts of Allied intelligence, the battle to regain control of mainland Europe began in earnest. At the Trident Conference in Washington, D.C. the previous month, the combined US and British Chiefs of Staff had actually set a date for Operation Overlord for the 1st of May, 1944. Nevertheless, the British were keen to gain a foothold in Europe much sooner. Sicily was just the first step. The whole of Italy was the real prize, or so Churchill and his military advisers argued. But General George C. Marshall, US Army Chief of Staff and the real driving force behind America's war effort, was under great pressure from General Douglas MacArthur, commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, to give him more resources for the war against Imperial Japan. Marshall was prepared only to commit US forces to an invasion of Sardinia, and instructed General Dwight D. Eisenhower to only mount such operations in exploitation of the attack on Sicily as might be calculated to eliminate Italy from the war. Once the Trident Conference was over, Churchill and his senior-most military advisor, General Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, flew to North Africa to try and persuade Eisenhower that Marshall was being short-sighted, to ask for his support for their call for an invasion of Italy. Under pressure from Marshall, Eisenhower was forced to be cautious. He told the British leaders that if Operation Husky was successful, he would then lend his support for moving on into Italy, but not before. While the Allies remained tentative for Hitler's Axis powers, a major political and strategic crisis was developing. Inside Italy, there was now a real fear that the Allies would topple the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, and Adolf Hitler looked on events in the Mediterranean with increasing anxiety. As a result of the huge burden placed on German forces by the fighting in Russia and the loss of 8 Axis divisions in Tunisia earlier in the year, the cupboard in the Mediterranean, so to speak, was practically bare. The big strategic question now facing the Führer was where would the Allies strike next? His Mediterranean theatre commander, Field Marshal Kesselring, and the Italian army chiefs all believed that an invasion of Sicily was imminent. But Hitler wasn't so sure. Blinded by the complete lack of reliable intelligence, he believed that the Allies would land in Sardinia. From there, they would logically take Corsica, which would be a stepping stone for southern France or Italy. Alternatively, the Allies might invade Greece. Hitler based his thinking on information gleaned from top-secret documents found on a Royal Marine officer whose body had been washed up on a beach in southern Spain back in April 1943. The Spanish authorities who found the body believed that the Royal Marine had drowned in an aircraft crash in the Mediterranean. Copies of the original documents passed on to German intelligence by a pro-Nazi Spanish naval officer appeared to show that Sardinia and Greece were next on the Allies' list. Hitler therefore ordered the dispatch of a panzer division to Greece, another motorised infantry division to Sardinia, and 2 elite parachute divisions to southern France to be ready for any invasion. In fact, the whole affair was the product of a remarkable British intelligence operation, as the Royal Marine in question had actually died of pneumonia back in Britain. His body had been dropped into the sea very close to the Spanish coast by a Royal Navy submarine, and all the documents and letters planted on him were of course fake. Thanks to this clever deception, the 500,000-strong Anglo-American army assigned to Operation Husky would outnumber the Axis troops left to defend Sicily by nearly 2-1. The Germans, in fact, had only 2 under-strength formations with which to repel the onslaught. No less than 8 British, American and Canadian divisions were set to attack on the first day of Operation Husky, making it the biggest military operation undertaken by the Allies to date in the war. In fact, more men would land on Sicily in the first 24 hours of this invasion than would land on the Normandy beaches in a comparable period on D-Day, almost a year later. And what's more, 2 further divisions, 1 British and 1 American, would then reinforce the Allied beachhead on Sicily once it was secure. As the sun rose on the 5th of July 1943, 5 invasion fleets under the overall command of Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham steamed towards Sicily from opposite ends of the Mediterranean. Off the fortress island of Malta, less than 24 hours before the actual landings, the fleets formed 2 groups. The first was the Eastern Task Force under Royal Naval Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, made up of almost 1,700 warships, troop transports and landing craft, complete with 4 British and Canadian divisions under the command of General Sir Bernard Montgomery. The second group was the Western Task Force under US Navy Vice Admiral Kent Hewitt, with another 1,700 vessels and 4 American divisions led by Lieutenant General George S. Patton. The planners of Operation Husky had one other surprise ready for the Axis troops on the island, namely parachute and glider troops ready to land behind the invasion beaches from the 1st British Airborne and the US 82nd Airborne Divisions. Following the successful but costly German airborne landings in Crete in May of 41, the Allies had raised several divisions of parachute and glider troops, and Operation Husky was set to be their baptism of fire. Eisenhower, as ever the consummate professional, selected his deputy, General Sir Harold Alexander, widely known for his charm and coolness under fire, to take charge of Operation Husky. If charm and a cool head were ever needed, it was now, because serving under Alexander as his principal battlefield commanders were General Sir Bernard Montgomery, famous for his victory at El Alamein, and General George S. Patton Jr., well known for his swashbuckling, aggressive leadership style. Husky was the first operation in which both of these ambitious and notoriously egocentric battlefield commanders would find themselves serving alongside each other. And from the outset, if ever 2 personalities were destined to clash, it was Montgomery and Patton. The Allied invasion of Sicily kicked off in the early hours of 10th of July 1943. Patton's 7th Army would land on a 40-mile front on the island's south coast, while Montgomery's 8th Army would come ashore on a 40-mile wide front on either side of Sicily's southeastern corner. In the early stages of the planning for Husky, it had been intended that Patton's primary objective was to be the port of Palermo on Sicily's northwestern coast. But Allied military strategists were concerned that American troops lacked the combat experience necessary for such a bold operation. Instead, the 7th US Army was given the job of protecting Montgomery's left flank as it advanced towards Messina to block an Axis retreat. For the American general, widely known as Blood and Guts Patton, this can only be described as a red rag to a bull, and he was determined to prove the doubters wrong about the operational value of the men under his command. And as Husky gathered momentum, Patton soon got the chance to prove the point beyond any possible doubt. Things couldn't have been better for the massive Anglo-American invasion fleet, as it was able to approach Sicily virtually unopposed. Despite the fact that German U-boats managed to sink 6 invasion transports and landing craft, there was no sign of enemy aircraft. In the lead-up to Operation Husky, Allied bombers had wrecked all the airfields on Sicily, forcing the German Luftwaffe and the Italian Regia Aeronautica to withdraw their remaining aircraft to mainland Italy. Against 4,000 Allied aircraft, they could only muster 1,500 machines. In fact, the main opposition to Operation Husky came from the weather. The day before the invasion, during the afternoon of the 9th, the wind whipped up a tremendous storm, which resulted in many of the men in the invasion fleet becoming horribly seasick. Fortunately, the strong winds abated in the final hours before the first Allied troops stormed ashore. But in the skies above Sicily, there were strong air currents that played havoc with the formations of troop-carrying aircraft and gliders en route to their drop zones and landing zones. The paratroopers and gliders were scattered all over the south of the island. 47 out of 134 British gliders ended up in the sea. However, the sudden appearance of airborne troops who did reach their Sicilian destination created mayhem behind the enemy-held beaches. At 2:45 in the morning on the 10th of July, under the cover of a shattering naval bombardment, the first Allied assault troops waded ashore. Eisenhower's strategy had enabled the Allies to swiftly establish their first foothold on European soil. But although the invasion force knew full well that the enemy lay ahead of them, they had little idea of how much resistance they would be facing. Interestingly, in the British sector, nearly all of the defending Italian troops encountered by Monty's 8th Army surrendered, with little or no attempt to put up a fight. Not surprisingly, the majority of the men serving in the 6 Italian coastal defence divisions on the island were Sicilian. They had little affection for Mussolini's fascist regime, and even less desire to see their homeland destroyed by the ravages of war. Within hours, Montgomery had 4 divisions ashore, together with most of their heavy weapons. However, Patton and the Americans encountered much stronger opposition. On the first day of the invasion, Italian and then German tanks put in an appearance, but the Italians were quickly sent packing. Later in the day, though, a battle group from the Hermann Göring Division succeeded in overrunning an American infantry battalion. The next day, the 11th of July, General Alfredo Guzzoni, the Italian commander-in-chief of all Axis troops on Sicily, ordered the Hermann Göring Division reinforced by the Italian Livorno Division to drive the enemy back into the sea. What's more, German and Italian aircraft based on the Italian mainland joined in the attack, and the US troops were soon under siege. Patton's men fought desperately to keep the enemy at bay as panzers advanced to within 2,000 yards of the invasion beaches. Eventually, American ground and naval artillery broke up the Axis onslaught, and to the right of the 7th US Army's beachhead, a hastily assembled force of paratroopers and infantry stopped another German counterattack. Patton's 7th Army suffered 2,300 casualties during the bloodiest 24 hours in the whole of the campaign for Sicily, and the Americans would suffer even more heavy losses before dawn broke on the 12th of July. Aircraft and gliders carrying 2,000 men were ordered by Patton to reinforce the 82nd Airborne Division, and although 23 aircraft were shot down, killing a further 200 US paratroopers, the threat in the American sector had passed. With the beachhead secure, the Allies were swift to introduce two new American technological developments that would end up playing a huge part in defeating Adolf Hitler. The tank landing ship, or LST as it was officially known, and the amphibious 2.5-ton supply truck, more confusingly known as the DUKW, proved invaluable in Operation Husky. Needing to get men and munitions ashore at speed, the Allied invasion forces no longer had to depend upon the early capture of an enemy-held harbour, something that would be crucial when it came to Operation Overlord. This planned invasion of Western Europe was already gathering momentum, and the British engineers were busy developing an even more ambitious project to make sure that Allied troops and supplies could be put in place precisely where they were needed. Mulberry was the code name for a prefabricated floating harbour capable of rising up and down with the tides off the coast of France. But a great deal more work was going to be needed to turn the daring concept into a reality. Even so, having succeeded in getting hundreds of thousands of Allied troops safely ashore in Sicily, the cracks in the Allied High Command were beginning to show. Canadian and British troops had quickly cleared the island's southeast corner, but as they pushed northwards towards the port of Messina to trap all of General Guzzoni's Axis forces, they met with stiff German resistance. Panzer tanks, reinforced by elite paratrooper units flown in from southern France, now stood in the way. The landscape also played its part too in making things more difficult, because behind the panzers was the semi-active volcano Mount Etna, rising 10,000 feet above the plain of Catania. To outflank German positions in the foothills of Mount Etna, Montgomery got Alexander to shift the boundary between his 8th Army and Patton's 7th Army on the 13th of July. The boundary shift allowed the British to advance up Highway 124, the main road into the centre of Sicily, before turning northeast at Enna towards Messina. Patton was furious. Like many American generals, he detested Montgomery. By redrawing the inter-army boundary in Montgomery's favour, Alexander was consigning the 7th US Army to the role of flank shield for the 8th Army. Patton decided that the best way to get back at Montgomery was the capture of Palermo, Sicily's capital, as well as a major port. With Palermo in US hands and his supply lines secure, he could then push east towards Messina and get there before his British rival. To soften Alexander up, he got him to agree to a reconnaissance towards the town of Agrigento by his troops. Once Agrigento fell on the 15th of July, Patton persuaded Alexander to allow him to drive for Palermo. Brushing aside his British superior's second thoughts, Blood and Guts formed a special corps of 3 fast-moving divisions to seize Palermo. The Italian troops they encountered on the way did very little to stop them. Palermo fell on the 22nd of July, and 48 hours later, the whole of western Sicily and 53,000 Italian soldiers were in 7th US Army's hands. In Italy, news of the capture of Palermo by Patton's troops was followed days later by the collapse of the fascist regime. Although he'd been dictator of Italy since 1922, Benito Mussolini had always shared power with the Italian monarch, King Victor Emmanuel III, and the Italian army. The king and the army had never liked Mussolini's alliance with Hitler. Now it threatened to bring them all down. The Allied invasion of Sicily was a warning to the anti-fascist plotters that they were running out of time. The final push was provided by a big US bombing raid on Rome on the 19th of July. The target had been the main railway marshalling yards, but many bombs fell wide, killing and wounding hundreds of Italian civilians. The mood in the city was now very hostile to the fascist regime. On the 24th of July, Mussolini summoned the fascist Grand Council in Rome to head off the growing political crisis. Much to Mussolini's surprise, his fellow fascists informed him that they'd lost confidence in him and his leadership, and the following day the king dismissed him from the post of Prime Minister and had him arrested. Without a shot being fired, Mussolini's fascist regime collapsed. Marshal Pietro Badoglio, a former Italian army chief, became Prime Minister, and somewhat anxious not to antagonize the Germans, he announced that the war continues at the side of our Germanic ally. News of Mussolini's downfall came at a critical moment in Hitler's campaign in the East. Since the 5th of July, a titanic life and death struggle between the Wehrmacht and the Red Army had been fought in the baking heat of the Russian steppes. But for the first time in the campaign on the Eastern Front, Anglo-American military operations would play a crucial part in deciding its outcome. For most of the previous 5 months, there'd been stalemate on the Russian theatre. An attempt by the Red Army to exploit their stunning victory at Stalingrad had been foiled by a brilliant counterattack of German forces, scraped together by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Hitler's best battlefield commanders. The city of Kharkov, captured by Soviet forces in February, was retaken by a Waffen-SS Panzer Corps in March. But the Red Army had managed to hang on to a bulge of territory 120 miles wide and 90 miles deep between Orel in the north and Belgorod in the south. At its centre was the town of Kursk. As warmer weather returned to the Russian front, Hitler and his generals considered what to do next. On their maps, they could see that the front line now ran from Leningrad in the north to Rostov-on-Don in the south. The bulge at Kursk and the Soviet armies crammed into it seemed ripe for the plucking. German Army Chief of Staff General Kurt Zeitzler wanted to slice it off in a powerful pincer movement. So too did two of Hitler's other key field marshals, Erich von Manstein and Hans von Klug. But the Führer was not yet willing to commit himself. After the capitulation of the last Axis forces in Italy on 13th of May, he now feared an Anglo-American landing on mainland Europe. Should the Wehrmacht try to wipe out the bulge at Kursk, or should it wait for the Red Army to launch its main summer offensive? A big preemptive strike might upset Stalin's own plans. But if the Anglo-Americans landed in Sardinia or Greece or Sicily at the same time, Hitler would have no reserves to spare for the Mediterranean theatre. For once, the Führer couldn't make up his mind. His inspector of panzer troops, the famous panzer commander General Heinz Guderian, was firmly against the proposal. He asked Hitler, "Is it really necessary to attack Kursk? Indeed, in the east this year at all? Do you think anyone even knows where Kursk is? The entire world doesn't care if we capture Kursk or not." The Führer replied, "I know. The thought of it turns my stomach." Codenamed Operation Citadel, the Kursk offensive originally planned for the 4th of May was repeatedly postponed. In the meantime, information passed on to the Soviet High Command by British intelligence through the dummy Lucy spy ring based in Switzerland and the Red Army's own sources gave Stalin plenty of warning of German plans. By the summer of 1943, the Wehrmacht and the Red Army could field roughly 6 million soldiers each. But Nazi Germany was losing the arms race to the Soviet Union. Day by day, the balance of forces on the Russian front was tilting away from Hitler towards Stalin. For the attack, the Wehrmacht was gathering no less than 50 divisions, including 17 panzer divisions, and providing the attack with extra punch were the new Tiger tanks, Panther tanks, and massive Ferdinand self-propelled 88mm guns. Altogether, the Germans fielded 900,000 men, 3,000 tanks, and nearly 2,800 aircraft earmarked for Operation Citadel. But the delay in starting the offensive gave the Red Army time to construct an elaborate system of minefields, anti-tank ditches and anti-tank gun positions to protect the whole of the Kursk bulge up to a depth of 95 miles. To prevent any breakthrough by the enemy, Stalin had committed no less than 1.3 million troops, 3,600 tanks, 20,000 cannon, and nearly 2,800 aircraft. So in addition to having lost the advantage of surprise, the Wehrmacht was outnumbered. Nevertheless, on the 3rd of July, with no sign of any major Allied move into the Mediterranean, the Führer finally gave Operation Citadel the go-ahead. "24 hours later, German troops launched probing attacks on the Red Army's outer defensive perimeter. The next day, 5th of July, the main offensive began. On Army Group Centre front, the 9th Army under General Walter Model, forming the northern pincer of Operation Citadel, tanks battled to crack open the Soviet defences on a 30-mile wide front. But after 4 days, the attack stalled. In the south, 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf punched a hole 20 miles wide. By the 12th of July, they were on the verge of breaking through the Soviet defences. On that day, the world's biggest tank battle to date occurred when 2 German and Soviet tank armies met to fight it out at Prokhorovka. For 8 hours, thousands of sweating, frightened men rode inside their heavily armoured machines, hurling steel projectiles at each other in blinding heat and choking dust. Hundreds died, their bodies torn apart by shards of molten steel or incinerated by exploding fuel and ammunition. But even as the gigantic tank battle was raging, the Red Army launched an offensive against the Army Group Centre. Model's 9th Army was forced onto the defensive. The next day, the 13th of July, Hitler reviewed Citadel's progress. Some ground had been gained, but German casualties had been heavy, 50,000 dead and wounded. The Anglo-American invasion of Sicily 3 days earlier made the Führer a very worried man. Anxious to scrape together the reserves he needed to keep Italy in the war, he ordered a halt to the Kursk offensive. The decision marked the beginning of the end for the Germans in Russia. From now on, the initiative lay with the Red Army. Within a fortnight, the Wehrmacht was forced to abandon the Kursk battlefields, and on the 5th of August 1943, Moscow celebrated the liberation of Orel and Belgorod with a huge firework display. Just under 3 weeks later, on the 24th of August, Soviet troops recaptured Kharkov for the second and last time. In the meantime, Hitler was busy trying to prop up his Italian ally, Il Duce Benito Mussolini. On the 19th of July, Hitler flew to Italy to confer with Mussolini. At a heavily guarded villa in Feltre, the Führer talked non-stop for 2 hours to infuse his friend Il Duce with fresh courage and resolve. On the 24th, Hitler's headquarters received the news of Il Duce's resignation at the same time reports were coming in from Hamburg of a big air raid on the city. The raid was the first of 3 attacks on Hamburg in which RAF Bomber Command confused German radar defences with hundreds of thousands of aluminium strips, codenamed Window. With Luftwaffe night fighters and flak guns blinded, the British dropped incendiaries onto the old centre of the city, setting it alight and creating a firestorm that sucked everything and everyone into its path. An estimated 30,000 men, women and children lost their lives, and 500,000 people were made homeless. In the final days of July 1943, rumours of the destruction and death toll in Hamburg spread a wave of fear through other German cities so far untouched by Allied bombing. And within the Nazi Party, people asked themselves for the first time, would popular discontent at the way the war was going cause the Hitler regime to collapse like Mussolini's? In the Allied camp, General Patton was determined to get to Messina first. He told one of his commanders, "This is a horse race in which the prestige of the US Army is at stake. We must take Messina before the British." The 7th US and 8th British Army found themselves pinned down in the foothills of Mount Etna. and even when they succeeded in levering out the German and Italian troops from their hilltop positions, Allied troops were held up by enemy minefields and bridge demolitions. When the first American troops entered Messina early on the 17th, they found it to be deserted. Shortly after Patton had accepted its surrender, a small British motorised column entered the port. Blood and guts had won the race, but it was a hollow victory. In just 6 days and 7 nights, 40,000 Germans and more than 60,000 Italians had been evacuated across the Straits of Messina, along with most of their vehicles, heavy weapons and stores. With Sicily now in their hands, the British and the Americans could safely direct sea convoys through the Mediterranean instead of having to send them all the way around Africa to the Suez Canal. Late on the 17th of August, the day Operation Husky ended, 571 Halifax and Lancaster bombers took off from bases in Lincolnshire and East Anglia to attack the top-secret German experimental weapons centre at Peenemünde on the Baltic. In the preceding months, RAF photo reconnaissance missions over Peenemünde had uncovered the existence of the A4 long-range rocket and the FG-76 flying bomb, which Adolf Hitler hoped to use against London before the end of 1943. During the RAF attack, 1,600 tons of bombs and 231 tons of incendiaries were dropped, destroying much of the site and killing more than 730 people, including 2 key German scientists. The British hoped that this air raid would deal a fatal blow to the Nazi secret weapon programme. But as the year drew to a close, it was clear that the Germans were continuing with rocket and flying bomb trials in testing centres beyond the range of Allied bombers. Also on the 17th of August, Churchill and Roosevelt and their military and diplomatic advisers met for the second time in 3 months, this time on Canadian soil at Quebec. The conference was codenamed Quadrant. On the agenda, Operation Overlord, the Mediterranean Theatre, the Far East and Tube Alloys, the codename for the joint Anglo-American project to produce an atom bomb. For months, the British leader had been advocating landings on mainland Italy because, from there, the Allies could strike at the Balkans or open the sea route to the Soviet Union via the Aegean if Turkey could be persuaded to abandon her neutrality. Roosevelt met Churchill halfway. Once Allied troops were firmly established in Sicily, Eisenhower was ordered to begin planning an invasion of Italy. Mussolini's overthrow made the project urgent, but there was a time limit, as many of the invasion craft provided by the Americans were due to be transferred to the Pacific. However, where should the Allies land? Churchill was all for landing as far up the Italian peninsula as possible, starting at Rome. Why should we crawl up the leg like a harvest bug from the ankle upwards? Let us rather strike at the knee, he growled. Eisenhower's planners, unwilling to land anywhere beyond the range of Allied fighters, settled for what they believed was a safe compromise. Operation Avalanche, a landing of 190,000 British and American troops in the Gulf of Salerno on the west coast of Italy. Once safely ashore, Allied troops would advance on Naples to secure their supply lines, and then move forwards to the Adriatic to trap German forces still in southern Italy. Hitler, informed by his intelligence agencies that the Italians wanted to defect, ordered the concentration of powerful reserves outside Rome and at other key locations throughout Italy. Should Badoglio switch sides, the German command drew up a plan, codenamed Axis, to seize the King of Italy and the Italian government, disarm all Italian troops and occupy key installations. But Hitler still hesitated, and in the meantime he'd not forgotten his friend Mussolini, who'd been imprisoned by Badoglio's government since the 25th of July. SS paratroopers under the command of Major Otto Skorzeny were given the task of finding Il Duce and bringing him back to Germany. On the 4th anniversary of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's declaration of war on Nazi Germany, British and Canadian troops belonging to Montgomery's 8th Army crossed the Straits of Messina in an operation codenamed Baytown. Under the cover of a heavy artillery barrage, they stormed ashore at Reggio di Calabria and encountered absolutely no resistance. By nightfall, they had taken prisoner of 3 German stragglers and 3,000 friendly Italians. For the first time since April 1941, British troops were back in force on mainland Europe. But Montgomery had always doubted Baytown's value. In his view, a landing by the 8th Army at the toe of Italy would not help the main Allied landing at Salerno when it occurred, but he did what he was told. However, his troops, delayed only by small German rearguards, seemed to be in no hurry to advance northwards. Over 2 days, from 5th of September, American and British troops in the 3 divisions and the 2 commando brigades taking part in the assault phase of Operation Avalanche embarked from ports in North Africa and Sicily. They belonged to the 5th US Army under the command of General Mark Clark. Mark Clark's army was due to land on a 35-mile front in the Gulf of Salerno, between Amalfi on the Sorrento Peninsula on the left and Agripoli on the right, with the town of Salerno roughly in the centre. Clark hoped to surprise the enemy, so he dispensed with the usual preliminary aerial and naval bombardment. This was an unwise decision. Clark was a courageous and charismatic officer, but so far in this war he had not commanded troops in battle. As the invasion fleet headed towards Salerno, news of the signing of the armistice with Badoglio was broadcast on Allied radio. The announcement took most Italians by surprise, but it stirred the Germans into action. Troops under the command of Field Marshal Kesselring, Hitler's Mediterranean theatre commander, quickly implemented Operation Axis. Most of the forces Badoglio hoped to bring over to the Allied side were either disarmed or overwhelmed. Fortunately for the US 82nd Airborne Division, its planned airdrop on Rome had been cancelled at the last minute. However, the main Italian battle fleet succeeded in putting to sea from its base at La Spezia. While it was steaming past Sardinia to meet the Royal Navy, the battleship Roma was blown apart by a new German anti-shipping weapon, the HS-293 glider bomb. But the rest of the Italian fleet arrived safely in Malta. On the 11th of September, Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet, signalled the Admiralty in London, "Be pleased to inform their lordships that the Italian battle fleet now lies at anchor under the guns of the fortress of Malta." In the 12 hours before they landed in the Gulf of Salerno, the 80,000 Allied troops taking part in the assault phase of Operation Avalanche discovered to their dismay that the enemy knew they were on their way. Luftwaffe bombers launched sporadic attacks on the invasion fleet. Before dawn on the 9th of September, the first waves of British and American troops boarded their landing craft, and as they approached their invasion beaches, they came under fierce enemy fire. In the British sector, warships supporting the landing by the 46th and 56th Divisions bombarded enemy coast defences. But in the American sector at Paestum, the commander of the 36th Texas Division, going into action for the first time, obeyed Clark's order not to lay down a supporting artillery barrage on the shore. As a result, the Texans suffered heavy casualties. Field Marshal Kesselring had guessed correctly the location of the Allies' main landing in Italy. To defeat it, he had deployed 6 divisions under General Heinrich von Wittinghoff, commander of the 10th Army, in easy striking distance of Salerno. But at first, the Allied landings went well. American Rangers and British Army commandos quickly captured the town of Salerno and seized the mountain passes leading to Naples on the 5th US Army Corps' left flank. However, the 3 assault divisions soon had a hard fight on their hands as they pushed further inland. The flaws in Operation Avalanche began to show themselves. The 5th US Army beachhead was too wide for just 3 assault divisions, and von Wittinghoff's combat veterans moved quickly to exploit the gap between the British on the left and the Americans on the right. The Rangers and Commandos defending the mountain passes found themselves dangerously exposed to probing enemy attacks. On the 12th of September, the fighting at Salerno entered its most critical phase. The Germans were determined to eliminate the 5th US Army's beachhead before Montgomery's 8th Army had time to reinforce it from the south. In the next 72 hours, fierce counterattacks mounted by German battle groups almost succeeded in driving the Americans into the sea. But the enemy was driven off by the 5th US Army's own artillery and the guns of the Allied warships lying offshore. Allied reinforcements were rushed to Salerno, and the moment of crises passed. On the 16th of September, Montgomery's 8th Army finally linked up with Mark Clark's 5th US, and on the same day, von Wittinghoff ordered the German 10th Army to withdraw to the north. The 5th US Army's ordeal at Salerno was finally over. As usual, the Germans fought a skillful withdrawal. It was not until late on the 1st of October 1943 that units of the British 7th Armoured Division entered Naples, which of course was Operation Avalanche's primary objective. Operation Avalanche was over. It had cost the Allies more than 12,000 casualties, including 2,000 dead and 3,500 missing. But von Wittinghoff's outnumbered and outgunned forces lived to fight another day. The Allies had taken their first tentative steps onto the European mainland, but the struggle for the underbelly of Europe, as Churchill was fond of calling Italy, was only just beginning.